pleasure to introduce Ryan Jenks. Probably doesn't need an introduction with most of you. You know him well from YouTube, and he is going to talk right now about nerdy Dyneemalogy, if I pronounce that correctly. Give it away.
I came up with that title at the last minute. I thought it made for a good title for how nerdy of the topic it is. Recently, I've made a few videos about Dyneema, which in turn brings back more feedback. And so I talked to a Cortland engineer, and I've talked to other Dyneema nerds, and I've learned quite a bit. And I want to talk about kind of the process in which it's made, something that happens at the molecular level, and the SK78s, SK75s, the stuff that we mostly use. How amazing SK99 Max is, and then where Dyneema is not good. And I think that's important to talk about, because I have people tell me about things they're using it for, and I'm like, that's the one thing it's not good for. And I want to make sure people know when it's nice and when it's not nice to have. And then I'd like to find out where you guys are maybe incorporating it in bigger projects, because it doesn't make for a great tagline if you need to grab it, but we'll get to that in a minute. I tested 7 different qualities, and you'll know there's synthetic ropes on Amazon, eBay, that are what I joke is Chineema, the generic version of Dyneema. And Dyneema is a very specific thread that's made in the Netherlands, and that's what they're making Amsteel from Samson, and Marlow makes their D12 stuff out of. So you have these rope manufacturers making these 12 braid ropes that you recognize the brand name, but they're making it out of Dyneema. Well, these no-name brands, it's actually pretty impressive how strong they are. The problem is it's not just the strength. It's like comparing the top speed of a car that you plan on using where there's speed limits. If you're never going to put more than X amount of force on something, strength isn't your only thing. What happens is these cheaper synthetic lines, they end up doing a very flat weave instead of a very weavy round weave. And in turn, if you're pulling eye to eye, I found that it's actually stronger. But as soon as you turn it into a soft shackle, if you do buy the cheap stuff and use the soft shackle, it's 30% weaker than if you make it with SK75 or the SK78 that a lot of Slackline companies make it out of. And that can safety margin in most soft shackles. But as we get into grog loops and double wrapping 3mm soft shackles, and we get push the limits of what we could do with it, I think that stuff matters. So it's nice to know the Chineema is super strong enough for most things, but it's also nice to understand that it starts to wear out faster, right? That flatter pattern, the different material, it doesn't last as long. As soon as you bend it around something, the fatigue happens faster. Now, creep is not a problem. Creep is where it stretches over time at, I believe, the molecular level. And so when they do these heat treatments where they run it through a thing that tensions it inside this hot box, it takes the molecules and straightens them out. And then they'll attach, on some of the fancier ones, they'll attach barbs to the strands so they lock in place like Velcro, so they can't creep over time as the pieces go alongside of each other. There's lots of things they can do, which matters when you're doing 900-meter long zip lines that you have to keep retensioning every time somebody goes. But that's also just the rope settling itself. But with soft shackles, we don't really care about creep. That's just never really an issue for us. Fatigue is a concern over time if you have enough cyclic loading, but there's obviously been no cases where you can I don't know a scenario that would even matter. User error is still going to be the biggest concern in a soft shackle or being homemade. And that leads me to the grog loops. News to me that those are becoming more and more popular. I feel like they're kind of a royal pain in the butt to splice something like that you can't take off. If you're going to have a system that's permanently together, I suppose that could make sense. But yeah, they become more and more popular. Now, this leads into our redundancy talk that we're going to talk about in 15 so minutes. If your grog loop fails, what's backing it up? It's another grog loop. So it's interesting what diameters we can get.
Can you say what a grog loop is for me that doesn't know that? And then also Hi-Tai mentioned something in the chat that it's easier to undo, but you can comment on that later if you want to.
Yeah. Where is the chat? I want to see. Oh, there we go. I'd like to find out more about grog loops at the end of this talk here. But I tested them, and I saw that, was it Rad or who else tested them? Somebody else tested them. And they're good. Grog loops are basically round loops spliced, but instead of just splicing into each other, you crisscross it first and then put it into each other. It's basically a round sling that you're making out of 6mm Dyneema. The thing is, the idea behind it, as I understand it, is you don't have this big head that's obnoxious to walk on. And I found that my solution was making 3 or 4mm soft shackles and double wrapping them. It's very important to understand double wrapping. And the head is so small that it's irrelevant at that point. You know how we used to use like 6mm soft shackles for 2 sewn loops? Well, the 5mm button head is 25% smaller, and we found out 5mm is super good enough for most situations. But as soon as you go to 4 or 3mm, it's almost just invisible. But that's just because I'm a soft shackle guy and I really like taking it off. Now, when I'm done talking, I'd love to hear Hi's stuff about grog loops. Soft shackle comparison, the button knot still has been reliably the most compact knot and the most strong knot, because the tails get buried back into the knot and spliced into the legs, which allows the noose that goes around below the head to have like the biggest bend radius, and that's where it fails typically, is around the noose. Now, SK99 Max I want to talk about. That is, ironically, twice as strong for 4 times the money. But if you're buying something that's like 3mm or not that much of it, it really doesn't, the price isn't that big of a deal, especially if you're talking like you're already spending thousands of dollars on Highline gear. The 99 Max stuff is made out of biomaterial. It's still plastic, but it's supposedly it's less bad for the environment. But it's also they just found a way to make it stronger, and it is like I legitimately could not break these 6mm soft shackles as it was going over 93 kilonewtons, and my machine just like pooped out on me, and I just like it without changing to the old pulley system, I can't pull more than 90 kilonewtons. But all Dyneema from Marlowe, I believe, all the D12 is becoming that. If you see on their website, they'll have D12 bio, SK78 bio, SK99 bio. They're starting to move towards it, but it still costs more money to make, so they still kind of have both floating out there. But I also found out that what you're buying isn't necessarily bio-based. They're just contributing, like if they pay enough to the program that Dyneema has for bio-based stuff is basically everyone's getting bio-based. Dyneema is just making this stuff. And the more the companies pay for it to happen, the more credits they get to brag in the marking. So it's all moving that direction. But it's interesting how like it's not a conspiracy. It's just like a misunderstanding of how the material you have in your actual hand, whether or not it's what you bought from the marketing. Anyways, soft shackles, taglines. Oh my gosh, this is the main reason I wanted to talk about this. And then I'd love to talk about grog loops. An ascender will shred a 5 millimeter. What? You're shaking your head. I got to know what you're going to say.
I'm saying don't use an ascender.
Okay, yeah, because like it shreds it at 2 kilonewtons, right? Obviously, you're not supposed to use it, right? But it literally shreds it at 2 kilonewtons, right? Now in Sweden, we had a capstan. Like we weren't trying to put ascenders on it. But when we needed to, we didn't, or we would have broke it. And then we're like, shoot, how do we do this? In hindsight, everything's easier after you've had, sleep and a shower. We could have put 6 ascenders on there, equalized them, and just like took a little weight off to move things around. However, it's not good to grab, so it's not great for like a tagline you have to like do stuff to. It cannot be a nice clothesline because it's you can splice into itself. It's very smooth, and if you're going to run, a carabiner attached to all your 50-meter segments across, that could work. But you have to have another rope, of course, and you have to know the length of it to tension it. And then however that rope is attached to that Dyneema has to be not too bulky in order for the shower curtain method to work. Has anybody used Dyneema in a tagline scenario? And has anybody tried to use it as anchor material outside of like whoopee slings? Because that's not as popular anymore. But I'm just talking like 8 millimeter diameter Dyneema rope you're tying BFKs in. Is anybody doing that? Stephen, how did you incorporate the tagline in your 300 meter? Can you share that?
You're currently on mute.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we used, I think it was 3 millimeter typical Dyneema, and we had from Edelrid a box as a, what is it? It's the counterpart of the mini tracks, micro tracks. And we had this amazing rope grabbing thing that we have in the shop for pulling on it. So this worked pretty well for 300 meters.
On 3 mil?
Yes.
And Arthur, on the go ahead.
Taking it back into the bag was a mess because it all tangled up in the end, of course. But 300 meters worked pretty well.
How much force do you think you were putting on while you were pulling it over?
Not too much. It was Dynamite main, Dynamite backup, so pretty lightweight setup. I think about 40, maybe 50 kilos.
Okay, in that range, anything works, right?
Yeah.
If you have like bigger stuff, I think that's where it gets difficult.
Sure.
But yeah, I've used paracord, I've used all that stuff with micro tractions, but I'd be curious to test what the limitations are of the different size diameters.
So for the recent 2,700 meter record line, Arthur's saying that he used 4 millimeter Dyneema for the signaling line. However, the last, how many hundred? The last couple hundred meters were not that.
The last, we used the middle 2 kilometers are 4 millimeter Dyneema, but the middle 2 kilometers. The 350 meter on either side are a 7 millimeter rope from Mammoth that contains Dyneema but isn't a braided Dyneema that you can splice, and it goes very well into a micro traction into an ascender. So we tension for that because we didn't know how to.
How did you connect?
The ends of the Dyneema are spliced, and we used a carabiner to connect to a figure 8 knot.
Okay, nothing sliding over that connection.
No, nothing sliding.
Gotcha.
I don't know how to splice a classic accessory cord to braided Dyneema. I don't know if it's possible. Probably a geeky splice, a really complex splice would be possible, but I don't know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just nice to know the limitations of that if you are doing some higher tension stuff. I'd love to use it more as a shower curtain method, but I'd have to figure out how to have something on both ends, like you said, to be able to like actually move it around.
You need to know the length you need and like how you're gonna do it. You need to plan ahead.
A lot of planning, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, Chineema is pretty good. I would never use it in a Highline life-saving situation. SK99 Max is amazing if you have money you don't know what to do with. And don't use Dyneema as a tagline without being really cognitive about the difficulty of grabbing it. But again, you can stick like 6 micro tractions right next to each other and just equalize it if you're really desperate. I wish I thought of that. So.
In Belgium, we use it a lot as a curtain system for the top line. We use always Dyneema, and it worked really well for the 800 meters line last year in Belgium. And we tension it with a winch, with a rigging winch, and it worked really well.
Yeah, with a winch, right? But is that by hand or by capstan winch?
It can be with both. It works with a rigging winch. It's like, working pretty well.
Yeah, if you have a winch.
Yeah, of course. But you can use a friction, it's called again. Yeah, like friction anchor pole. It's used in the arborist stuff as well. I'm pretty sure it will work as well. But of course, you need to cool down the line when you are pulling.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But anyway, with a longer line, with classic tagline, you always need to cool down the line. So
there's some repelling descenders in canyoning that have like lots of arms and legs, and they look really weird. And if I had one of those, I would have been able to lower out the Dyneema a lot easier because you can just keep adding reps until you're happy. But then you also need to throw in snow or water on that thing as well. It doesn't have enough friction to get it hot enough generally to melt itself, because it just takes a lot more work to generate the same amount of heat like a normal sheathed rope might. So it almost balances itself out, unless you're into really, really big stuff.
Yeah, there are like arborist friction hitches, mechanical ones, but you use that on Dyneema, it just doesn't do anything.
I'm going to totally explore that, because like the fact that I had that problem, didn't know what to do, was like, I would love to know if I could just VT Prusik this thing. But
somebody has developed like a finger trap that they posted on Slack chat for capturing Dyneema. The only problem there is you need to thread it through first, like before you even start.
Like a sleeve.
Yeah. I mean, you just use a larger diameter.
Yeah.
And that's a finger trap. But the problem is that, like, if you're pulling through a lot of tagline, which you generally do, it's just going to destroy both of them, especially the finger trap. So I've been thinking there's probably if you thread a metal tube and the sleeve on top of it, you can store the sleeve while you're pulling and then unhouse it onto the actual Dyneema once you're ready to grip it.
Huh, that's a good thought, because of course it would grab it. It's just keeping it out of the way until you want it. Interesting. I did ask the Cortland engineer if I could splice 5 mil into 6 mil, just into itself. And yes, basically is the answer. So you can play with different diameters and the finger trap will work on them.
Yeah, and if you really need to go from one diameter to another, you can unweave it and reweave it as another way of splicing, a more advanced splicing method. And I think that method might work for going from, don't quote me, going from 12 strand to like Kern mantle too.
Gotcha. I mean, there's got to be a way. There's a splicing nerd out there that would know that. I'll find them. Should we? How long is each talk?
So the idea is to have a 20-minute talk, a couple of questions, and then a tiny break. If you want to recap or make your point across very clearly at this point, that's probably a good idea.
One last thing is, I just had a climber literally yesterday talk to me about, because they're like, I'm excited about soft shackles. I literally have a soft shackle shirt on, and they're like, oh, where are we going to use Dyneema and climbing? And I'm like, your sewing slings are Dyneema. You're like, you got it. Don't worry about it. And it's like, don't even make loops with it. You have to splice it so deep that like a sewing sling is so much better than anything you're ever going to splice. And the ultralight cams at Black Diamond got the thumb loop is Dyneema. But then they have an expiration date of like 5 years if you're using them. And they're like, well, that seems expensive. And no one's going to do that. So in about 15 years, we're going to start hearing about people breaking them. But it's not great anchor material unless you have like one of those loopies, or like you're intentionally splicing it and incorporating it into something. But to just treat it like a rope and tie it into a BFK or a tailless BFK, you can get away with it. We have gotten away with it, but it's just like, that's not what it's meant for. Now there are Dyneema ropes with Dyneema core, Dyneema sheath, but like that core and sheath thing works a lot better if you're going to be using it like a normal rope. So apparently loopies are bad too. Tapering. I tested tapering, and like, how much can you just blunt cut it? Can you cut it in an angle? I found that it doesn't affect it a lot. What I found was what I was connecting it to pull on it to test the taper was affecting it more. You know how like the whoopee slings, we had girth hitch under like glue and bolts? Like, we're all worried about the berry length, and it's like, oh gosh, that thing, the girth hitching the eye is definitely reducing the strength more than this. Holistically, you want your thing to be great. You don't want to make them poorly just because you're poorly attaching them. But yeah, the bend radius around the eyes, like we clip it to a carabiner, right? Or the eye of the shower curtain, right? He's clipped with a carabiner. That actually reduces it way more than any situation where you're not tapering it. And I just found that to be an interesting learning lesson when I was trying to learn something else. let's see here. Grog loops. Hi. Tell me about grog loops. Enlighten me.
All right, let's have a 5-minute open discussion, and then we can start with the second talk after that. Is that good with you, Ryan?
It sounds good. I'd love to hear Hi's grog loop.
This will be 5 minutes of unstructured time then before the next talk. Okay. Sound good? Okay. Yeah. I mean, Philip Queen has been playing around with grog loops. I think like in conjunction with maybe Jerry. They've done a few. I think the benefit is, of course, that you don't have a soft shackle in there to come undone, and then also you don't have the big knot in there either. They're super easy to splice. It's the reason that it's a benefit not to have a soft shackle is like if you put them in and you don't really, they're easier to check than a soft shackle where the button knot is in the sewn loop. You can't actually check that. You can kind of like look at it through, but you don't really know. And you can also, for a soft shackle, you can put the button knot outside, but then there's situations where it's in a bag and it comes out and nobody checks it there either. So grog loops, I guess the advantage there is that it's a little more semi-permanent. They're pretty easy to undo though. And yeah, I guess. You
don't thread them.
What do you mean?
You don't put thread. I
don't think Philip Queen is doing that, no. I developed my own kind of version where you do an endless loop and then you send the tails out of the loop and you grog splice the tails. So normally with an endless loop, it's very susceptible to pulling out. But the grog splice can act as your tail, right? So normally, if in that kind of splicing scenario, you get like 70%, which is kind of like what a whoopee happens. When the splice comes out of the Dyneema, that's where it explodes. But
yeah,
you know, that is actually going to be shared with the grog splice itself. And you don't need the grog splice to be super deep buried. So you just need a little bit of bury on it. And that seems pretty promising. And it's locked. You know, the grog splice locks it, which is pretty interesting. But I haven't tested it, so it could like explode at like.
If you don't bury the tails like very well, it's not like 100% locked. So is there anybody doing cyclic load testing on them?
There would be a fun one to test. I guess. So in my version, it's actually the endless loop that's holding all the strength, and the grog splice is the lock. But in just a regular grog splice, I guess Philip Queen has been putting it in Highlines, and it hasn't come undone or even come close to being undone. But they're very kind of scary because you can undo them by hand.
I have a comment. Big things. Back in the days when I started splicing, I created for myself a personal anchor sling from spliced Dyneema. And I used this in all my climbing trips for about 2 or maybe 3 years. And the attachment loop that I spliced came undone after about 2.5, maybe 3 years. So this cyclic loading from just sitting back into the personal anchor again and again and again and again made the tapered end slowly crawl out of the spliced section. So you end up with the brummel that I had in there. So it didn't worry me too much. But I think in rock, this might be, because there's no brummel in it, might become kind of problematic over time. So I don't think cyclic loading would be perfect for these things. So please don't use them in a perma freestyle rig or something like that.
My only concern, like they're strong, especially if you're burying them proper enough. If you bury them like 1 fib length, I found that they were like less strong. But it's the cyclic loading I don't know, and I don't know how to test. I don't have the ability to test a grog loop under 10,000 cycles, because that would be very interesting. Sure wish I had a machine.
Did you sew it? Like locked it with a sewing or not? Because normally splices like that need to be kind of sewn. It's only because when you don't have tension on it, it can slowly come undone. But it's not about cyclic loading. If you have a tension and you cyclic loading, so you do some cyclic loading on it, I'm not sure you will get anything from it. Maybe because, yeah, it's, of course, it's slippery. Maybe it will slowly come undone, but like, I don't see the point. But when you don't have tension on it, of course, yes. And when you use it, as you said, of course, you remove all the tension and sit back, and remove all the tension and sit back. And that's why it come undone, but not because of cyclic loading, because of unloading.
Cyclic unloading.
Yeah, there's a comment in the YouTube. Leighton Calder says that they use Dyneema and polyester sheath in all their BFKs and natural anchors, much lighter to hike up and less back and forth abrasion, I guess, is what he said.